For those people just arriving, my name is Racheal WEYMER, and I'm the Director of Fisheries at EcoTrust Canada. And today I'm presenting on why it's so important that coastal people be at the helm of the blue economy. EcoTrust Canada is based on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, also known as Vancouver. And so my presentation will be sort of West Coast focused, but in a federal context. So we need to get the blue economy right. Resilient marine and socio-ecological systems are imperative to achieving our globally agreed upon sustainable development goals, but also healthy marine ecosystems, resilient coastal economies, human health, meaningful livelihoods, enduring cultures depend on it. We believe that commercial fisheries are key to successfully developing the blue economy. Just as some examples, many values are derived from commercial fisheries, things like family income, harbor infrastructure, local tax revenues, healthy local food, cultural resilience, and stewardship opportunities. But many of the most important values are intangible. These quotes are pulled from EcoTrust Canada and T-Buck Suzuki's report, Understanding Values in Canada's North Coast. We heard things like, if we lose our fishing, we lose our identity. Or I'm lucky my job allows me to spend time in the least explored places of the planet, the oceans. Or feeding people, providing good, healthy nutrition. How much more important can you get than that? But these values are lost when local access is no longer held by working harvesters and adjacent communities. For decades, people on the West Coast have seen these values ebb away as the fishery consolidates and remote companies, non-fishing license holders, and foreign investors have taken greater control of fishing licenses and quota. And as the wealth of the fishery is drained away, with it goes the opportunity for current and future livelihoods, a sustainable option for resilient communities, and well-being on the coast. So this seems to be happening more on the West Coast and then the East Coast for a number of reasons. But one of the main is that the policy environment on the East Coast seems to prioritize coastal community well-being more than it does on the West Coast, where they have prioritized economic efficiency. But as you'll see by the next few slides, it's not really working in a big E economics kind of way either. So as you can see by this chart, Canada's fishing industry has seen dramatic growth since the Great Recession. So you'll see the landings in black, the landed value in orange, and the export value in blue. So Canadian harvesters landed 10% less fish in 2018 compared to 2009, but across Canada, the landed value of the catch actually grew by 106% and exports by 78% after accounting for inflation. But the industry growth in the Atlantic provinces and Quebec was much stronger than it was in British Columbia. So as you'll see here in this table, the landings in the Atlantic decreased by 21%, but the landed value increased by 84% and the export by 97%. Things were not the same on the Pacific. Our landings decreased by 15%, yet we only saw a 36% increase in landed value and a 48% increase in export value. That's half the gains that they saw on the East Coast. And the trend worsened in 2019. As you can see here, the Atlantic landings decreased by 30%, but the landed value increased by 83% and the export value by 74%. Meanwhile, on the West Coast, our landings decreased by 20%, but the landed value increased by only 8% and export by 14%. So catch is still dropping, the value is still increasing, but the value of BC product compared to East Coast product is much, much lower. And as you can see in the next slide, this is unfairly impacting communities. So this image that you see here was created by Tasha Sutcliffe. She's a senior policy advisor for EcoTrust Canada. She created it for Simon Fraser's Community Economic Development Program when she was doing a course there, teaching a course there. So the slide describes what a fair and prosperous fishery could look like compared to the current system. So I'm going to walk you through this inverted triangle from landed value up to wholesale value up to retail value. So in recent years, a typical landed value for BC fisheries would be about 400 million, but that's not where the story ends. Landed value is not the full value of the fishery. When that seafood is landed in a fair and prosperous system, the value would be translated into local harvester income, which would then be spent at local businesses, supporting other local jobs. And as we move up to the wholesale value, in a system that prioritizes community benefit, a greater proportion of that wholesale value would be realized at the community income level. And this is seen as the seafood moves through local and adjacent docks, processors, and similar businesses. And when we move to the retail value, working our way up, a greater proportion of that 850 million would turn into a potential 1.5 billion in regional economic income, with seafood being sold at regional fishmongers, restaurants, retailers, and grocery stores. Then we also see the extended values along the top. Sorry. And then we're thinking of things like pride and livelihood, bustling communities, heavy employed community members. Intangible values are harder to measure or attach a monetary value to, but they contribute significantly to social capital, well-being, and resilience of coastal communities. Now, if you go to the other side in the current system, the 400 million in landed value no longer equals revenue for fishermen. The lion's share of the landed value goes into the pockets of a leaseholder, who is more often than not a large private corporation or speculative investor, and has often never stepped foot on a fishing vessel. Harvesters will get a percentage of the landed value, or maybe even paid a wage. And in this situation, they might not have enough money to spend in the community or keep up their boats. And in the current system, we see a fraction of the potential wholesale value of the community income level. The leaseholders are often the wholesalers as well, and determine where the product is processed and sold, and there's no incentive to prioritize local job creation. Subsequently, at the retail level, if the fish has been shipped off and processed elsewhere, it is really challenging to realize the full retail value as it becomes increasingly difficult for local retailers and restaurants to access the product. And then this all means that we lose the extended values that are seen in a fair and prosperous fishery. If we want a sustainable and vibrant commercial fishery in BC, we need policy change. We need to regulate the local control of access to active harvesters and First Nations. And that means phasing out foreign ownership, phasing out ownership of licenses by quota and non-fishing entities, rentiers, and investors, and developing a made in BC owner-operator policy. We need to foster intergenerational succession, prioritize local food systems, and strengthen ecological connections and better management by fostering local resource management and collaborative governance.
3 minutes left.
3 minutes? Okay. So when the federal government, so when the federal government began their consultation on Canada's blue economy strategy, we made these following recommendations: to prioritize rich, resilient local food systems and develop and implement a blue economy strategy through meaningful engagement and with First Nations and coastal communities, and to modernize current fisheries policy on the West Coast. So we also work with a group called the Fisheries for Communities Network, and we jointly created these recommendations as well. To develop and commit to implementing a new policy framework that requires that BC licenses and quota can only be owned by bona fide fish harvesters and First Nations, and that they establish an independently led and inclusive, transparent engagement process. And then develop an implementation strategy with pathways and transition mechanisms for that policy. And finally, that the implementation framework must provide transitional supports and fair compensation for people who are trying to get out of the industry. So the blue economy strategy can and should support commercial fisheries and coastal communities. And when the federal government did a large consultation on the blue economy strategy, they found the same thing. As you can see by these quotes that I pulled out from their report. One of the main ones being the blue economy strategy is a huge opportunity to protect independent fish harvesters and coastal communities, and it would be a legacy achievement we could all be proud of. So we have been working on owner-operator issues for a long time at EcoTrust Canada, and we are very excited to see how much it's been included in this report. And we're not alone. We have a strong consensus around this. So now, as governments turn their attention to the development of blue economies, we're faced with an opportunity to redefine our priorities. We need to ensure that the blue economy strategy includes policies that protect and enhance local economic benefits and more sustainable and balanced socio-ecological systems.
It's great to see the alignment of the what we heard report with what you've had as well. We have time for one minute.
So in your fantastic graphic with the little monopoly man.
Yeah.
I guess in your recommendations, I wonder if you could go just a step further and talk about maybe some of this, if any, specific ideas there are to essentially take money away from pretty wealthy quota or shareholders.
Yeah.
And change that system. But inevitably, there are some people who will lose wealth. And I mean, from a personal point of view, I think that's a necessary step, but I'm sure that there's pushback on that.
Mhm.
So I wonder if you've explored what that might really look like in terms of a policy, real steps.
Yeah, I think it's one of the things that we hear is on the West Coast is that you can't unscramble the egg. And but I think that really what needs to happen is that the federal government needs to put up some money. Because it's these policies that, although they were intended to be good for communities, I'm sure, but they haven't had those impacts. So I think that there needs to be some kind of compensation at the federal level for those harvesters that are relying on this for retirement.
So like a buyout program.
Yeah, something like that. And I think I could follow something similar. I don't know, like transition-wise could be similar to PIVCAF, like time bound, and a slow progression, maybe. I mean, it'll take some consultation and to figure out exactly what user groups or stakeholders and nations want. But thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, so our next speaker is Syma Evans, speaking about fishing for space and the new blue economy, conflict and cooperation between the fishing and wind industries and two northeast U.S. working waterfronts. So if you want to sit there,
and I'm going to also be speaking today with my colleague Nat Trumbull, so we're going to split the time, and I'll sit here and you want to move there, and I'll just use some when.
Yeah.
All right, so thank you, and good afternoon, early evening, and thank you for being here. And as I already mentioned, my colleague Nat Trumbull is going to be helping me, or he's going to be delivering the last half. Let's see. And I do want to also acknowledge the traditional owners on the land where I live and work and who have stewarded that land for, millennia. But I'd also like to recognize and acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on today and who have stewarded this land as well, and as well as those other Indigenous people who are with us today. So thank you very much. I kind of reconfigured our talk after hearing other people's talks. I wanted to get to the end quickly. So I'm going to just start out and say that what we hope to do is to focus on the shoreside impacts of the offshore wind industry on fisheries. And we are examining the impacts in the working waterfront in ports in New England on fisheries and aquaculture operations there. And we specifically focused on 3 ports, New London, Connecticut, Bridgeport, Connecticut, and New Bedford, Massachusetts. And basically our take-home conclusions, as I said, I did want to kind of lead with the end points, is that, governance is critically important. Wind energy has really come and it's perturbing the port business ecosystem. Port space has always been scarce and competition is occurring. But getting the blue economy right will depend on getting the governance right. And where we are this could really be a case study on how to get the blue economy wrong. Because in New London, the experience with the offshore wind development, which Nat will talk about more, has generated conflict because the governance has been critically flawed. It's been top down. It has been the opposite of transparent, opaque. It has been not participatory nor inclusive. It has excluded the public, the local municipality, existing businesses, everyone who's worked at the state pier that's being used for it, local relevant regional and local municipal and regional agencies from being at the table. They've all been excluded. It's been dominated by powerful commercial interests, notably, transnational companies like Ørsted. And it appears to be an iron triangle at this point where the offshore wind industry, our Connecticut Port Authority, and the governor have been calling the shots in a very kind of closed type of approach to governance. The Connecticut Port Authority that I mentioned has been plagued by mishandling and corruption, cost overruns, high staff turnover. We won't talk about any of the nitty gritty, but hundreds of newspaper articles have documented it. But I believe that with good governance that's transparent, accountable, responsive, equitable, inclusive, consensus oriented, and follows the rule of law, it may be possible to chart a path forward that allows commercial fishing and aquaculture operations to coexist with what's going to be a very large offshore wind imprint on the terrestrial area. And there may even be opportunities for cooperative relationships to develop. The blue economy seeks to transition to a future ocean where economic development is harmonized with social and ecological well-being. It places green technologies in that blue environment, hopefully avoids brown development. It wants to achieve that, triple bottom line. So that's where we're starting from. That's the goal of where the blue economy wants to go. And if it's done right, possibly it can get there. But what's clear is there will be no win-win outcomes until all entities who can win or lose are at the table with both agency and voice. And if you aren't at the table, we say, then you're going to be on the table. So this is about setting that table and making sure all the people are at it. And maybe that's a reflection on earlier today. I know we're all familiar with this working waterfront, but basically, the blue economy is really seeing the ocean area as a new kind of frontier for development. These working waterfronts are going to be critical areas to provide links between locations and the rest of the world in this globalized transportation network that we have. Ports have had challenges. These, they've been invisible. The people who work there are invisible. They've been over time segregated, separated from the urban centers that have grown up around them. They're often invisible to the local community, in fact. There's been a loss of space and access. So these ports, the waterfront is valuable to many non-water dependent uses, and some of them, the cost of real estate is sky high. So it's been redeveloped so that, we have hotels, restaurants, residential development, all competing for the same waterfront spaces. And it's also limited, and these coastal margins are now shrinking because of climate change and sea level rise. So these areas, this is just going to be exacerbated as we move forward. So, in part because of the climate change, we've been looking to decarbonize, looking at, bringing in offshore wind as a new, renewable energy source. And in fact, one of the first things US President Biden did was to establish a target of employing tens of thousands of workers to deploy 30 gigawatts of offshore wind energy by 2050. And also to get up to 100 gigawatts by 2050. So that's an impressive goal to set, considering how little we have at this point. And so really this move to a green economy is shifting to this offshore blue economy, and wind is really being developed. You can see this is a BOEM, a Bureau of Offshore Energy Management, that I just downloaded. These are all the active lease areas on the East Coast right now. So it's booming, leases are booming. And as I said before, this offshore wind has a terrestrial impact. There are different kinds of ports that they need for staging and marshaling and constructing, storing, operations and maintenance. these change through the life cycle. And at this point, a recent article in 2022, earlier this year, by Parkinson and Kempton estimated that basically right now, what's total and planned and existing marshaling ports in the US are going to provide less than half of what it will be needed to support that offshore wind development that's being envisioned. So, you know, I think here we're all familiar with the basics of what you need in a fishing port. You need a safe place to moor. A lot of it depends on your fleet. You know, you can beach. When I was on the Kuskokwim, folks beach their boats on the beach, and others need deep water ports. And the 3 bullet points you see here, you need a provisioning for utilities and boat servicing, fish handling, marketing and infrastructure. These items I consider part of a business ecosystem that must surround ports for them to be able to service a fishery. And I know we heard Madeline Hall Arbor describe New Bedford as kind of a port hub, and I love that term. And so you can kind of understand that there's an ecosystem that's necessary, a business ecosystem that must surround these ports in order for them to retain their use. We have offshore wind. It also has report requirements, and you can see here that they're not so dissimilar, you know, in the bottom line from what you might need. A lot of the infrastructure is going to be different. That's where the difference is going to be. That business ecosystem is going to be different. Okay, oh, this got rearranged. I'm going to just skip right through that. So, you know, here's I'm sorry if it's small. This is an EIS that was developed by the South Fork Wind Farm and was submitted to BOEM with their application. Basically, it looks at a lot of the ports in the Northeast and whether they have a commercial or for hire recreational fishery and whether they are suitable for wind industry needs. And you can see here that Stonington and New Bedford, among others, do have overlap between fishing and the offshore wind industry needs. So I already introduced this idea of ports as systems. You know, we basically have these systems that are business ecosystem where ports come together, where rather the businesses come together. And in these business ecosystems, we have some businesses, they each have their own niche or vital role to play. Together, they may create a more fertile business environment for other businesses to come. There may be healthy competition. Some of them can develop really formal symbioses. This is a field of industrial ecology developed by one of my colleagues, Marian Chertow at Yale. And other places, they may develop more informal relationships, these businesses. This has been pointed out at the Boston Fishing Pier, where you have inputs and outputs that are shared more informally among these different businesses. But what's clear is that business ecosystems can change over time as the result of internal and external events. Businesses can migrate, and they may thrive, but if not, they may migrate or they may be forced out of business. Just like a species response to climate change, they can either continue to adapt and thrive, or they may have to migrate, or they may go extinct. And what?
3 minutes.
Okay. Let me just go quickly. Ports are really being used now for engines of economic opportunity, and our methods, this is based on research we did in the Port of New London, and we published it in 2021, and now we're expanding it to interview fishermen, and we're just getting started. So this is really moving on, and we've been involved in the RODA, which is the Responsible Offshore Development Alliance synthesis of science document, and developing that, and as well as going to meetings and looking at these documents. So I'm going to pass the baton now.
Okay, good afternoon.
Sorry about that.
Remaining a couple minutes. So the arrival of offshore wind has really been and become a contact sport, and unfortunately the fishing communities are entangled in that almost inevitably. And one of our assumptions, and just want to jump ahead, these are our 3
Those are the
case studies.
conditions.
New Bedford up towards Boston, Bridgeport toward New York City, and New London in between. One of our assumptions is that all ports are not built the same, and so larger ports obviously are potentially more conducive to welcoming offshore wind without conflict with existing fishing industries. So we have sought using a rubric that Parkinson and Kempton have published to categorize some of these ports. And moving right along. So starting with New London, which actually maybe we can move quickly. We heard about this from Professor Paul Unker this morning. This was very, excuse me, that was in Bedford, wasn't it? So New London, closest to our university, is also a very deep harbor port that is in dire need of investment, and so is welcomed Eversource, Ørsted, large multinationals to help invest. But this has really put a lot of pressure on existing small fishing operations to the extent that they've been pushed off the port. If we just quickly glance at what's been happening at the ports, there's been a filling in between two of the existing piers. This needs to be very high capacity, high weight capacity construction, and the remaining fishing operations are without contracts and counting their blessings that they're able to stay at the moment. And then, so we've looked more closely at some of the polarized views based on some public comments that were submitted as this project was being permitted. But I think polarized is the best way to describe community views on this. Right, so why don't we keep going down to Bridgeport? So Bridgeport, closer to New York City, also has an available brownfield. We see less conflict here. This seems to be a case of coexistence where in agriculture operations probably are not overlapping directly with some of the wind that's coming in. This looks like more of an operations and maintenance rather than large scale construction sites. Okay, and let's jump up to New Bedford, which Professor Hall had spoken about. So this is probably the sole case of potential cooperation where there appears to be a lot of waterfront space and also a lot of potential. The fishing operations are so large in New Bedford that there really does appear to be, there are human resources that would be available to serve as crew and fueling and other potential contributors to the offshore wind based out of temporarily unemployed or available fishing fishermen.
This is a mayor, we can skip him.
Yeah, let's keep going. So, right, in conclusion, that's good you said, gave us in advance. What future awaits in our New England ports remains to be seen, but it does appear that institutional changes in government will be essential, and how decisions are made and by whom will be a critical factor. And the smoother, less than smooth outcome of this governance really is a large question mark today.
Yeah. We'll just ask that the presentation be switched over. Can you come up and switch over to the next presentation? While we do that, we'll just have probably a chance for just one question. Racheal and TNG and I have their numbered questions. I'll take it at the very back of the room. I think that's the first thing.
Yeah, there's a move in Atlantic Canada to decarbonize the fisheries. There's some study being done now, electrification of the fishing. If there was a similar movement in those ports, do you think that would change the relationship between the fishers and the offshore wind, because they could be the new fuel supplier?
Well, we kind of skipped over the place where cooperation could occur. And there is a company right now called Sea Services North America, which is composed of fishermen. It was started by a lawyer, but it's hired fishermen in different ports and they're actually servicing Ørsted and Abbotsford. Abbotsford is the one in front of the Park City in Bridgeport, and Ørsted running the vineyard, which is in London. So they've actually, I don't believe they're running fuel, but they are.
No, the electricity would be basically the decarbonization, so like put electric engines in the fishing.
Electrify the fleet.
And then they they no longer are using diesel, they're now using, yes, they're plugging it in each other.
That would be ideal, although I don't hear much about that.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that presentation. And now we'll welcome Megan Bailey, talking about positioning Canada's blue economy for growth and success through rights recognition.
Thanks so much. I'm gonna stand here and try that. Thanks. I have my clock on. I've been in meetings with Sheila before, so I should have known when I saw her as chair. But we're gonna run. Okay, the title has changed a little bit, but I guess the spirit and intent is kind of very similar. So blue economy and reconciliation, moving recommendations to action. I'm at Dalhousie University in the Marine Affairs program. Dalhousie is located on the unceded and ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq. That is or we understand kind of that relationship with the Mi'kmaq through the peace and friendship treaties that were signed between the British Crown, the Mi'kmaq, Wet'suwet'en, and Passamaquoddy peoples in the 1700s. So I'm from London, Ontario, and I went out west for my schooling, and I knew nothing about the peace and friendship treaties of the 1700s until I moved to Nova Scotia. So those treaties are important. On October 1st, we have Treaty Day in Nova Scotia, which is kind of a day that we're supposed to recognize, remember, and recall our responsibilities and the relationships that we have. And these treaties will become important towards the end of this talk. So, perfect, okay. With thanks to, there's a large number of people on here. So I want to make clear, I'm not an Indigenous person. I'm speaking about my experiences and perceptions and involvement in some projects. One of them is a book chapter. Ken Paul is also an author on it. It was led by Russ Jones from the Haida Nation. It's about reconciliation and marine use, marine and ocean management generally across the country. And then the second project is a lobster conservation study with Sipekne'katik First Nation. So if you are unfamiliar with Sipekne'katik First Nation, they're one of the Mi'kmaq communities in what's now Nova Scotia, and they launched a moderate livelihood fishery. I'll call it a treaty fishery. That was met with a lot of violence. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that project as well. And the reason that I think it's really important that we talk about blue economy and reconciliation is that in reviewing the what we heard document from DFO, Indigenous peoples is mentioned 113 times in that document. It's a 58-page document. So twice per page, Indigenous peoples are mentioned. So it seems impossible to not think about how the blue economy also deals with reconciliation. So a question, can blue economy offer? And here is a definition of reconciliation. A process that seeks a genuine, just, and enduring end to the conflict between the parties and transformation of the nature of the relationship between the societies through a course of action involving intertwined political and social changes, and which addresses both politically tangible issues such as distribution of power and historical responsibility. I think I could end the talk now and say, no, blue economy cannot offer this, but given that kind of background of the language within the blue economy report, reconciliation as an extremely, not important even, but just like necessary and right process that's happening within our country right now, we have to address this issue, I think. So I'm going to lean a little bit in the beginning of this talk on this book chapter, two book chapters that Russ Jones led. These are chapters within a forthcoming book called Canada's Oceans, Pathways to Sustainability in a Sea of Change. Recognizing, that as I was saying that title in practicing my talk, that this is a terrible name, Canada's Oceans, the possessiveness of Canada owning those oceans. So Derek Armitage is also a co-author on this book, a co-editor. I don't see him in the audience, but we need to maybe think about the title of that book with UBC Press. So one of the things that Russ led us through was this assessment of, the extent to which reconciliation is happening in marine management. And to do that, we looked at forms of injustices that result from colonization. So we looked at three: political domination, loss of territory and benefits thereof, and cultural imposition. And then went to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples to say, what do the UNDRIP articles say to help us think through what reconciliation would look like addressing each one of these injustices, okay? So if we look at political domination, we would say that one of the things we would look for in a marine issue or governance problem to say that reconciliation is occurring is effective Indigenous organizations in place at appropriate scales. That's UNDRIP Article 18. self-government or management agreements in place. That's under Article 4. So we went article by article and said, specifically related to marine management, what articles help us to understand reconciliation? And again, so we did this for these different forms of injustices, and we looked across multiple cases throughout Canada. So we looked at Syma, the Pacific North Coast Integrated Management Area, Pikilas-Sossurak, which is an open water polynya system between Canada and Greenland, the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline Inquiry, I think in the 1970s, treaty rights in Atlantic Canada, and the Northern Shelf Bioregion and benefit agreements with multiple First Nations in British Columbia, and walked through these as case studies, trying to recognize like what is happening and relying on kind of our authors' experiences in these different environments to say something about that. Through that, we came up with 5 recommendations around ways in which either reconciliation is happening or is not happening in these different cases. There were a few other cases mentioned in the chapter as well. And I want to talk about these 5 recommendations in the context of something specific related to treaty fisheries implementation. So I'm going to come back to these in a second. So for the Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqey, and Passamaquoddy peoples, there's a treaty protected right to what is called a moderate livelihood. I will probably refer mostly to these as treaty fisheries. In the early 1990s, Donald Marshall Jr. was arrested for fishing without a license outside of the commercial season, fishing eel. He argued that he had a treaty protected right to do so. It went to the Supreme Court, and in 1999, he was exonerated of those charges and found not guilty. The Marshall decision set the scene for this idea of treaty implementation via a moderate livelihood. It's supposed to be, moderate livelihood is supposed to be something between a subsistence and a commercial fishery. So it means that one can earn money from the land and the sea, but only to a certain point. So anyway, we don't have time to unpack that, but there's a lot in there. But one thing that's really important here is that lobster is what I'm going to speak about. Lobster was in the news. Probably a lot of you have seen that. But moderate livelihood and treaty implementation here is not just about lobster, and it's not just about fisheries, right? So it's really about the land and the sea, and these are protected rights through that treaty that I discussed, the treaties from the 1700s. So in the fall of 2020, Sipekne'katik launched their treaty fishery. It was met with violence, opposition, flares at boats, traps were cut, boats were untied. There was a lobster pound that burnt down. So a lot of you might be very familiar with this. It made actually international news. And there was a lot of conflict between the non-Indigenous commercial fishing sector. And some of the big issues that were raised is that Sipekne'katik was fishing outside of the commercial season. So they were doing so, the commercial season in this area runs between late November and May. Sipekne'katik was fishing outside of those months. And so they were doing that and, didn't have agreements in place with DFO. So the commercial fishing industry really pushed back, saying that everyone should face the same regulations. And Dr. Sherry Pictou asked at a speaking series recently, so she's from Bear River First Nation, she's a legal scholar and also in the Faculty of Management at Dalhousie, is what kind of economy counts in the blue economy? Okay, and I think this is a really, really important question. So moderate livelihood is a form of economy. Does it count in the blue economy? And I'm going to go through those recommendations that were derived from that chapter to kind of understand the extent to which this is being this is part of blue economy, or reconciliation through blue economy is happening with a particular form of economy. My phone just went off. How am I at, Sheila? Perfect. Okay, so these 5 recommendations. One was adopted just an equitable reconciliation framework. And thank you to Sheila for sharing this with me, which I didn't know existed, but I think it's dated 2019. So that the DFO and Coast Guard has a reconciliation strategy. So this is a really great first step. That reconciliation and a strategy to do it with indicators and goals is there. I will note that it is listed as an evergreen document. So in the kind of spirit and intent of the greening of evergreen documents, I will offer a suggestion here, which is, for example, so one of the departmental results that DFO is looking for is enhanced relationships with involvement of and outcomes for Indigenous peoples. So there are multiple departmental results and indicators that DFO has outlined. An indicator of success for DFO is the number of agreements or arrangements involving Indigenous groups. There are probably communities that would see the number of agreements they have to have with DFO as oppression, as not allowing self-determination, as an indicator
of not goodness. Okay, and so this isn't just like we feel differently about these things, it's actually, like, this is actually like, if DFO is actively trying to do something because they think that's the right thing to do, and communities are actively trying to not allow that to happen because communities don't want it to happen, this is not, we're not going to find success within a blue economy for reconciliation, right? So really trying to understand like what are we trying to measure and achieve? So I think that's just moving towards the just and equitable part of that. Engaging Indigenous communities in visioning and planning. So I just want to kind of point out that on March 3rd, 2021, the minister at the time came out saying that she would be okay with moderate livelihood fishing activity if it was during the commercial federally regulated season and if it was with licenses issued from DFO. The very two things that Donald Marshall Jr. was found not guilty of in terms of violations against the Fisheries Act, right? So there's still this kind of box being put around when a treaty fishery can happen, even though the Supreme Court has said actually those aren't the limitations around when that treaty fishery can happen. So for me, this would say that the visioning and planning of treaty implementation within blue economy hasn't happened. Cooperatively pursue holistic management. I don't know about and Robert here, sorry about this. So one of the recommendations from Russ's paper was around ecosystem-based management, integrated coastal and ocean management, holistic frameworks and tools. And so I do just want to give a shout out to DFO and Alida and Rob and Maxie Musted and the team that's working really hard on developing an EBM framework. So that's a really great, I think, step forward. So I'm going to try to rush the last minute here, which is number D, is it 7 o'clock at night? Establish co-governance arrangements that integrate knowledge systems, share power, and redefine relationships. So this is one of the recommendations coming out of that reconciliation work led by Russ Jones. And really interestingly, I found this kind of really uncomfortable, is that in the Marshall decision, it says that responsibility for conservation is placed squarely on the minister responsible and not on the Aboriginal or non-Aboriginal users of the resource. So saying that Indigenous peoples don't have responsibility for conservation is extremely problematic, right? So because it's not recognizing the conservation ethic that they already are using within their fisheries management plans, within communities, et cetera, as well as ideas around self-government, self-determination, et cetera. So this is, a big issue. And then E, support Indigenous self-determination and development of research and management capacity. So Savaganagity launched a lobster conservation study. I'm working with them on it. When we applied for a science permit, we were told we could do science on the lobsters that were caught under one tag, but not under treaty tags. So in trying to get data about their fisheries, Savaganagity was told they can't collect data, they can't develop research capacity, they can't use evidence from their scientific desires to inform their fisheries management because they do not get a science permit from DFO to sample lobsters that they catch with treaty traps. So again, we're not really maybe recognizing reconciliation through that. So I just want to go back to this kind of question from Dr. Sherry Pictou. So what kind of economy counts in a blue economy? If the blue economy is supposed to be a vehicle for reconciliation, and I don't know if it is, but if it's going to be, then really trying to understand how reconciliation fits within this idea of economy and livelihood and income generation and profitability, et cetera, is going to be something that we all have to think a little bit about. So that's it. I know it was very, very fast, but I think within the 15 minutes. Thank you very much.
Great. So we do have a couple of minutes. I know we could take several hours to go through this really important topic, and hopefully we will touch on it again tomorrow. We'll talk about the blue economy during the plenary session. But yeah, we do have a couple of minutes. If there is a question while we get set up for Sarah. Is Sarah here? Sarah.
I haven't met her.
So she's not here. Okay, well that's well we do have more time then. If there's
This point, everyone uses the term fishing. How do you define it? How do you measure fishing? Is it number of pots you do or the number of pots?
That's a great question. I mean, do you mean specifically in reference to moderate livelihood? Yeah.
Just one thing when they say.
Yeah, I mean, we need a bit more specificity. So is it an action? Are you asking us what a catch? How do we measure catch? Like,
If we have both, then it's the number of pounds or the.
Yeah.
If we say the number of traps,
Yeah.
then we're talking about the operational definition of fishing.
Okay.
And how our governance rules are written, that needs to be there's a big difference in putting traps in the water, regardless of regardless of how much fish you get, or putting as many traps you want to, as long as you don't catch any more than a certain amount.
Yeah.
And that difference, I think, is critical
Yeah.
in the way the governance or rules, policies are written.
Yeah.
Comment on, and how are they doing it in where they are arranging now for the market life?
So lots of communities have launched livelihood fisheries. Lots of communities are doing so, working on agreements with DFO. Some are doing so without agreements with DFO, kind of community by community. For the lobster fishery, for those who don't know, it is an effort-based system. So each boat in each lobster fishing area gets a certain amount of traps that differs by lobster fishing area. So you put your traps in every day, in and out, and you catch as many lobster as you can. So this is not based like you. As the population of lobster has gotten more healthy, we're catching way more lobster now than we used to catch, right? So lobster stocks are doing really well, catch is really high, value of the fishery, even like during COVID when there was worry, I think it went up 21% last year or something like that. So this is an extremely healthy fishery. And so these kind of claims around conservation as being a reason to infringe on a treaty right is extremely problematic it's problematic for a lot of reasons. In the specific case of lobster, there's actually no evidence that there is a conservation concern. As far as I understand, no evidence has been presented.
No, because I promoted, I moved to expand as a way of managing not only lobster but other stocks as well.
Yeah.
Just wanted to get that point.
Yeah, no, thanks. It's a complicated thing.
Okay, I think this question and then over there.
I just think it's important to point out that
Yeah.
while each community has a livelihood fishery, they're not all the same.
Yeah.
The first thing that the bands did when they were developing their livelihood fishery plans was to look at their objectives. So different communities have different objectives. Some of them is for food production, some of them is about income, some of it's about food security. So each community developed their livelihood fishery plan. There are commonalities obviously between the communities. They're following the same effort-based management systems for the lobster, not for other things. And the nuanced differences really do fit the specifics of the community. And that's something that we don't do outside of the mud, outside of the main mud fishery. We have one size fits all for all fisheries in Atlantic Canada when it comes to lobster. Seasons change, but the purpose, the objectives of fishery are the same all the way across. And that's something that's not given into consideration with the very livelihood fisheries from the community's perspective to the DFO commercial fishery.
Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah, just a quick question about, blue economy, definitely has, connections with fisheries as a sector. Livelihoods based on fisheries, but blue economy will have also impact on other non-fishery systems, land-based, activities. So how is that included in the country?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as I was going through the blue economy, what we heard document, and I was as I had mentioned, Indigenous peoples being mentioned 113 times, and I wanted to know like in what kinds of ways are they being mentioned, right? And one of the things that came up a lot was Indigenous participation throughout the document. So I think participation, in the number of times participation was mentioned, it was like all but 3 times was about Indigenous participation. And then 3 times was like, I think industry leaders, like fishing companies and like maybe offshore sector or something. So there was this idea of participation that came out strongly to me, not related necessarily to fisheries, but just participating in the blue economy. And I'm not sure that participation gets to the spirit and intent of those, the criteria in UNDRIP, for example, right? So participating in the blue economy is not the goal. So I think the UNDRIP articles, for example, are really relating to, like, they're not sector specific, right? So they're about land and territory and benefits and governance, but it could be on all kinds of things. So whether it's an aquaculture development, whether it's, as we heard this morning, like the ability to say no to a nuclear plant or whatever, right? So I have to, admit I'm very much a fisheries person. And so that's kind of always my lens, but no, your question is a good one. And I think, something to continue exploring and trying to see where, how we move over in multiple sectors to make space for UNDRIP implementation within a blue economy framework. Yeah, but do you have ideas?
Confronted with, similar questions, because, in many places that we work, we don't look at, fishery-based livelihoods as complementary rights. So, there are many other things that constitutes livelihoods.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
blue economy is, the way blue economy is kind of, being proposed, it is going to intervene into those multiple sectors.
Yeah.
And therefore, an important aspect.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, I don't want to cut off the conversation, but I do want to get Paloma to get her presentation started up, because it did remind me that there is a bus leaving at 7:30, so we'll want to end just a little bit before 7:30 actually. So thank you very much, Megan. That was a great presentation. If you're ready, Paloma, we'll be speaking with us about co-creating accountability indicators with alternative seafood networks.
Thank you so much. Can everybody see my screen?
Yeah.
Wonderful. So yes, thank you. It's really an honor to be here, especially to be presenting alongside Dr. Megan Bailey, who's on my committee for my thesis. And I'm a marine policy master's student at the University of Maine in the United States. I'm advised by Dr. Joshua Stoll, who has also been presenting here. And for my thesis, I worked with the local catch network, which has been mentioned multiple times, but if any of you are just coming in, it's a community of practice of North American small-scale values-based seafood enterprises, which we're calling here alternative seafood networks. And it's a pleasure to present my research. The project is entitled Performing Sustainability, Co-Creating Accountability Indicators with Alternative Seafood Networks. So I want to kind of back up and start from the beginning and what we think about before we start researching. So what are the kind of underlying assumptions? And epistemology refers to what exists that we can learn about in the world. So realists conceive of reality as an objective idea, whereas relativists view reality as a set of mental constructions. And ontology deals with how we create knowledge. So objectivists see an absolute reality, whereas subjectivists see meaning as being imposed by the observer, and constructivists are somewhere in the middle. And then we can look at why we do research. So the theoretical orientation refers to what philosophy is really underlying the drive to research. Are we trying to predict? Are we trying to understand? Do we want to emancipate people or deconstruct ideas? And my research is really grounded in the emancipatory realm of critical theory, where research is conducted as a tool for social change, focusing on power relations and critiquing assumptions. But what was the impetus to do this particular project? So chances are you've seen eco labels. One of these, probably the Marine Stewardship Council blue label, is the most well-known and most ubiquitous. But awareness of, all these issues that we've been talking about over the last couple of days: overfishing, habitat loss, ocean pollution, labor abuse, issues of equity and access. Awareness of these issues have grown over the last half century, and third-party sustainability certifications have gained traction as a solution to some of these issues, or a way to address them. And today, $10 billion worth of seafood is certified by the Marine Stewardship Council. So the way a lot of these certifications work is that they're based on a voluntary set of guidelines. They're often set up by a non-governmental organization like the MSC. And they're actually administered by private auditing companies and paid for by the entity seeking certification. So they can be used as a marketing tool to kind of set sustainable products aside from the rest of the seafood. But the issue is that small scale operators have really historically lost out due to certification because of the high cost and the need for a lot of data to verify compliance. And so the ability to define on a global scale what is sustainable and what is not just a rhetorical power. The criteria themselves become actors in ocean governance, capable of changing the landscape of power. And this performativity of indicators highlights the importance of asking how indicators are created, who creates them, as well as who benefits and who profits from them and who may be negatively impacted. So in the creation of sustainability criteria, the MSC and NGO in the global north has positioned itself as an arbiter of what is sustainable and what is not. So with that in mind, we wanted to ask some questions. What alternatives are there to third-party certification already? How can alternative seafood networks demonstrate how they uphold their values? And how can values be operationalized into measurable indicators? So one example of an alternative to third-party certification is seen in the small-scale agricultural movement. And it's called a participatory guarantee system. And it's an alternative to formal organic certification. And it's been around for over 40 years. You can see all the locations around the world on this map, at least what you can see of the world in this map. But there's many. There's one that serves the US and Canada, certified naturally grown. And they're really specific to small scale producers because they require less data, they cost less. And one of the reasons for that is because they have a peer-to-peer review system. So instead of having an outside company conduct yearly audits, farmers audit each other. And this builds a foundation of reciprocity and shared learning. So our research lays the groundwork for the development of a participatory guarantee system for alternative seafood networks. To do this, we started with the 9 core values of the local catch network. These values, just to give you some context, were created by members of the local catch network during a year-long process in 2016. But how can you measure something like honoring the ocean? So to operationalize these, we use the methodological framework of participatory action research, which incorporates stakeholders throughout the research process and has the goal of producing a useful output for the stakeholders. And the research methods really evolved as the study progressed and adapted in an iterative way to participants' feedback. So first, we conducted a comprehensive literature review, mining for indicators related to each of the local catch network values. So for example, an indicator for honoring the ocean that came up in the literature was protecting and maintaining Indigenous peoples' access to seafood. And we stopped the search at saturation when articles stopped yielding new concepts. So you can see here the saturation curves for each of the core values. And a total of 221 articles were reviewed, resulting in a preliminary 169 candidate indicators. So we needed to kind of hone those down. And we did a workshop where we removed redundancies, we combined similar indicators, and out of that process, 5 new categories emerged with a total of 79 candidate indicators. The new categories were organizational structure, environmental impact, production, consumption, and spiritual connection. And this sunburst shows the candidate indicators grouped by the new categories and then color coded with the core values. So we still maintain that connection to the core values. The next step was to survey the local catch network. So we sent out a survey to the entire network. We received 31 responses. And the survey had 3 parts for each of the 5 categories that I just listed. The first asked the respondents to rank on a 5-point scale the degree to which they viewed each of the candidate indicators is important to an ideal values-based seafood enterprise. The second asked respondents to rank the top 3 for each category, and the third was an invitation to share reflections or even to suggest a new indicator if they wanted. And these graphs show the spread of responses for questions regarding organizational structure, consumption, and environment. And the next part of the process, which I think was really the core of the work, was an advisory committee. Many of the advisory committee members are actually here at this conference. And yeah, their input was really crucial for this. The advisory committee was consisted of 8 members of the local catch network who were directly involved with alternative seafood networks. We met with them 4 times as a group. They completed the survey and a group work assignment, which you can see here. And we had additional one-on-one meetings. And this process was based off of the policy Delphi method, which is a social science method that's designed to facilitate consensus among experts. And the rationale is that different knowledge bases and experiences complement each other, and even an expert can't know everything. So we adapted this, really. The traditional Delphi method uses anonymized information, and we had folks speak directly with each other to kind of reflect the relational nature of alternative seafood networks. So this process resulted in a set of final indicators, and I'm sure they will evolve in the future, but these indicators we kind of relabeled as aspirational targets. And to make them more tangible, we created specific questions designed to determine the level of involvement with each of these targets. And these questions became the indicators with a total of 103. And most targets could be met in multiple ways. The indicators aren't an exhaustive list, but they can give enterprise operators some idea of how they might reach those targets. So here is an example from the self-evaluation tool that we produced, and we're still making the final tweaks. So finally, I want to just reflect back on the research outcomes and look at, in what ways did it serve as an emancipatory function, and in what ways did it actually uphold the status quo. So though it was participatory, the advisory committee was not representative of all ASN or alternative seafood network stakeholders. One thing I'd like to bring up is that we lacked Indigenous representation, similar to the governance panel earlier. And we also lacked representation from deckhands, from processors. The people who participated were mostly enterprise owners and fishermen. So also of note, we lacked consumer representation, which was brought up by one of the advisory committee members who made a case for a consumer focus group as the next step, which I think would be amazing. There was also a tension between reaching for an ideal and being realistic about what an alternative seafood network could really control and achieve. And that kind of highlighted the difference between really small, family businesses and larger small scale businesses with employees. Lastly, we created a self-evaluation rather than a certification. So it doesn't in itself promote relationality or cooperation, but could be the first step in an alternative to certification. So if you'd like to learn more about this work and these ideas, you can stay tuned at localcatch.org for the release of the self-evaluation tool. And if you want to learn more about participatory guarantee systems, you can check out ifoam.bio. It's the International Federation of Organic Agriculture, and CNG Farming, which is the PGS that serves the US and Canada. So I want to thank the advisory committee, And shout out to Sonia, Kevin, and Pete, who are all presenting as well at this conference. And all the other support funders, especially Sitka Salmon Shares and the Switzer Foundation, and my master's committee, Joshua Stoll, my advisor, and my committee members, Cindy Eisenhower and Megan Bailey. So thank you so much.
I could stay on time. I couldn't whisper to you. So, yeah, so we have a couple of minutes, just 2 minutes literally for questions if we can set up the next presentation while we have just a couple of questions from Paloma. I'm finding it interesting. The blue economy is such a wide concept and is so diverse the presentations. It's it really is sustainable ocean economy. It just covers the gamut. Any question?
Yeah, I have a question for Paloma. Hopefully you can hear me. Certifications to work, I guess, require recognition from the customer base, and that's easy to do with a centralized certification process. But I'm wondering how you envision this kind of sort of like self-driven evaluation process being promoted or awareness being raised among the customer base that might use it to make decisions.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think at this point, it's still really early in the process of development, and I think it will probably evolve from here. But I think that this recommendation for a consumer focus group is a really good idea, and I think that could bring customers into the process and kind of give them ownership over the process as well. Which I think a lot of what like direct marketed and small scale seafood is trying to bring consumers and fishermen closer together. So I think that would be helpful. And I also think just, sharing out the self-evaluation and communicating about it, if an enterprise did want to use the tool, I think the more transparent enterprises can be, the better. And there's a huge issues with lack of transparency in the industrial seafood system, and I think that it's another opportunity to communicate and share information, and a way to do that.
Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Yes, it is showing the power of the consumer as well nowadays. Okay, so we'd like to welcome next Ian Stewart. Assessing impact, speaking about assessing impacts of offshore oil and gas exploration and development on small-scale fisheries, current challenges facing Atlantic Canada.
Hi, everybody. So I reside in Halifax, home of the Mi'kmaq, where we are treaty people. Great to be here. It's my first chance to speak to a fisher's audience. So, but on my way cab driving from the airport, my cab driver was interested in what I was doing here, and I told him a little bit, and he said, yes, Newfoundland has a golden future with offshore oil and gas. If only they could get the fishers on board. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, everyone knows that the cod collapse was caused by the introduction of oil and gas industry in the offshore Newfoundland. Nobody's laughing. That is a joke, because the offshore didn't start until after the moratorium. It didn't start until the mid-90s, really. But it's not a joke, because of course offshore oil and gas is in a very, very antagonistic relationship with the fishing industry in other parts of the world. And in fact, my cab driver was from Nigeria, and certainly African nations and many other parts of the world. Offshore oil and gas is in a very, very antagonistic relationship with, particularly with small-scale fishers. And so, indeed, my research in this field of thinking about offshore oil and gas and ocean resources began in the Nova Scotia context, which is very different than Newfoundland. So this is my first chance to speak and to think about and do some research in the context of a research project that includes impact assessment as a form of environmental resource management. This is my first chance to think about the Newfoundland context, and I'm very grateful for what I've learned from you all in the last couple of days about the Newfoundland context in particular. So the NADIA is the project which is funded by SHRC and the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, and looking at impact assessments from a socio-ecological systems lens. I'll say more about that at the end if there's time. So they're just very quickly, in case people don't know, exploration, two main types of offshore oil and gas production, exploration and production. Exploration is looking for essentially digging into the seafloor in order to find out whether or not the seismic data that one has actually is correct and suggests that there are oil formations. And production is actually what one refers to as the much longer stage, many decades long and many wellheads on the sea floor for actually extracting oil or gas out of the sea floor. So exploration is typically months to year, and production can take decades. Exploration is actually the more risky phase of oil and gas development, because the pressures of the oil and gas coming out of the sea floor are not known. And so that's where the famous Deepwater Horizon event in 2010 in the Gulf of Mexico was an exploration well. So they're much more dangerous, which is a point that may come up later. So is oil and gas development, does it even fit in a discourse around the blue economy, right? Is this talk completely out of place in this seminar, right? In this workshop, isn't oil and gas trying to fit that into a blue economy space, like trying to drive a blue peg into a round hole that doesn't fit, right? Or is it actually more like trying to rearrange the deck chairs on the Titanic, right? Getting the oil and gas industry so that it emits less in its production phases? Isn't that just rearranging the deck chairs on a ship that's actually headed towards disaster, because it's still producing and continuing through a multi-decade infrastructure, the reliance on hydrocarbons for energy and transport and everything else. I don't want to answer that question. Obviously, I have views because I've asked the question, but it is one of the contexts about that question about the blue economy that Newfoundland in particular is interested in, is aware of, is that its greenhouse gas emissions are dwarfed by those of other parts of Canada, particularly the oil and gas producing parts of Canada. So there's Newfoundland on the left, and you can see, but this data, which is provided by Environment Canada, is data which does not include scope 3 emissions. So part of the problem with the thinking about whether or not oil and gas development is consistent with a sustainable development goals and is consistent with blue economy aspirations, in particular with respect to offshore oil and gas, is that the calculations are always up till now mostly focused on how much greenhouse gas are emitted in the development stage, in scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, as opposed to what's the consequence of actually drawing those hydrocarbons out of the seabed and putting them into use, into circulation, right? So that's scope 3 emissions. And that's the harder question that is faced by those who are proposing that Canada's blue economy future can include oil and gas development, continued oil and gas development. So for example, the official discourse, the literature, there's literature out there in the blue economy space, which is rather silent on the question of whether or not oil and gas development is consistent with blue economy. So in this World Resources Institute, the famous plan for a sustainable ocean economy, this is, and many countries signing up on this, there's very little said about oil and gas. It's rather mute about that. In the Blue Economy Strategy document, DFO's, what we heard, it is also, there's no position being taken on that, and of course it does reflect, because there are a number of stakeholders that DFO listened to, there is a kind of range of views about whether or not oil and gas development is part of Canada's Blue Economy Strategy. So just to get that out there, some of us might think it's obvious, but others do not. And in fact, here's a quote: "In an ideal world, we could stop using fossil fuels tomorrow morning. That would be the best case scenario. The reality is that we can't. Clearly, we are heading towards a world where there will be less and less fossil fuels, pardon the grammar, in our energy portfolio, and more renewable energies, clean technologies such as hydrogen, wind power, offshore wind power." Now that's Stephen Guilbeault, right? Former Greenpeace activist, now Minister of the Environment, Canada and Climate Change, after approving the Bay du Nord project, a development project, which will come online in about 2028 and will produce oil and gas for probably 20 years, owned by Equinor, the Norwegian oil and gas company. Now I bring this quote is interesting in itself because the juxtaposition here is between oil and gas and hydrogen, wind power, and offshore wind power. But the sense in which those energy sources that are associated with the blue economy, the sense in which that is somehow other than and separate from the tradition and the culture and the technology and the know-how that has for 50 years been the oil and gas industry in North America, that, or more, sorry, pardon me, much longer, but offshore is relatively recent. That juxtaposition between those and the opposition between wind power and hydrogen and offshore oil and gas is not so clear, right? This is actually a somewhat beguiling opposition. And for a moment, I'll just see why. So in Newfoundland's own officials or government sense of itself, the report of the Premier's Economic Recovery Team, the Big Reset, there's no question that offshore oil and gas is a big part of the economic future and visions and plans, also for a sustainable and a blue economy as the government sees that. And this is in part because they want to expand the slice of the gray pie, the offshore royalties that will contribute to GDP. But this is also much more strongly articulated in the oil and gas industry's recovery task force document of 2021 about how the oil and gas industry can rebound and be part of Newfoundland's future. And one of the reasons why, I'm doing the wrong thing, sorry. I think one of the reasons why is that they very clearly in the oil and gas industry has worked very hard to situate its own future in a blue economy future, which will involve the development using, to put it broadly speaking, the expertise and the technology systems of that industry to advance hydrogen production, to advance innovation in all sorts of new energy technologies, and also to develop, for example, offshore wind and hydrogen technologies. So the point is that very clearly there is a very strong impetus from a number of sectors to say that although we might think of offshore oil and gas as a dying industry and as something that belongs to a fossil world, it is very much positioning itself, and many people are taking very seriously the idea that it is positioning itself for the future. And so this is partly why I'm interested in this question of the offshore oil and gas industry, and in particular the relationship, how it is that it's situated within the blue economy. Because my sense is, after studying this for some time, is that if what do we mean by the blue economy? Well, we're beginning to talk about this today and in other days, is that an economy is not a thing that you get. An economy is a complex set of relations, right? An exchange of values, and it involves material realities, and it involves dialogues, it involves conversations, and it involves a whole number of things. And this is a thought that I think Chris Millay is going to say about more tomorrow in his panel presentation. And so the sense in which we transition from a hydrocarbon economy into something else it's going to be a very, very complex, messy thing. And so my own view is that even if hydrocarbons were something we were getting off tomorrow, we have to get right what we mean by the relationship of this complex industry and the various kinds of conversations with other forms of communities and value generation, such as the small-scale fishers, which stand currently, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment, stand in a not so contested relationship with the offshore oil and gas industry in Newfoundland than they do in other parts of the world. But there are lessons learned that are very important. So this is, just for those who don't know, this is a map from a regional assessment of offshore oil and gas exploratory drilling, finished in 2020. This gives you a sense of the geography of things. And this is a map showing you where the number of exploratory wells that are hoped to be drilled within the next decade. The government of Newfoundland hopes to have 100 drilled. and how many actual go from exploration wells to actually development will of course depend on the resource, but presumably the idea is the more the better. And this is of course the point, right? Is that the whole attitude and mechanisms for assessing the impacts of offshore oil and gas on ocean resources and on fisher communities and fisher livelihoods is largely constrained by a management process that looks at individual well by individual well by individual project. It's very, very difficult to get a sense of the cumulative effects of this. But if you are talking about that many exploratory wells in this region, then it's not without reason that the FFAW, the union, the Fishers Union in this part of Canada, is extremely concerned about this heightened increase, the intensification. How are we doing for time?
2 more minutes.
Okay, so so the concerns of the small-scale fishers, in particular in Newfoundland, about offshore oil and gas and the harms that could come to small-scale fisher livelihoods, has to do with the impacts on fish habitat and health and the behavior arising from seismic surveys and arising from the exploration and development activities themselves. So that's a big part of, and in this sense, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans is a very important part of, is an ally to the fishing community, including the small-scale fishers, because DFO science plays a very critical role in questioning the proponents' claims to having no impact upon ocean fish habitat and fish health and fish behavior from seismic surveys and from exploration and development. There's also the issue of vessel movement and conflicts, the conflicts that come from vessel movements associated with the industry and the exclusions from fishing grounds that can happen because of oil and gas development. But most frightening for most people is the specter of an uncontrolled well blowout, either at the wellhead beneath the surface, which, as I said, is more likely statistically to happen for exploration wells, and also the surface release accidents such as that can happen from tanker spills. If you have a lot of oil being produced, you have a lot more shipping of oil that happens. So how does that relate to impact assessment and what's that got to do with the blue economy? Well, impact assessment itself is a federal, there's an agency, the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, there's a federal act, the Impact Assessment Act 2019 came at the same time as the Fisheries and Oceans Act. And this new impact assessment has a great deal of emphasis upon consultation, upon conversation, about the planning stage, which is about allowing for communities to be involved in questioning whether or not a project should go forward and how. And then there's a lot of activity of the proponent that takes place in giving information about, in particular, the oil and gas sector, where the expertise lies largely within the industry itself. And then there is a process of assessing that industry, and then there's a decision made by the government, and then there's follow-up and monitoring. Well, all of this, which is standard for all the various kinds of industries that the impact assessment process applies, has unique challenges in the case of the offshore oil and gas. And this is the main idea that is supposed to be science-based, evidence-based, Indigenous knowledge and community knowledge. Well, there's a great challenge that is facing the inshore fishing community in Newfoundland from the point of view of how it's going to relate to this burgeoning and apparently and in this industry that is going forward and growing. And that just to sum these up, the inclusion of small-scale fisher concerns in the impact assessment process. Blue economy is more than simply about understanding, whether or not we could do things sustainably. It's about, and perhaps primarily, it's grounded in a process of relations in which there is an inclusion of all those concerned in determining the collective futures. And that is a very constrained process in the case of offshore oil and gas. It's because so much of the capital and so much of the expertise is concentrated in the hands of the industry. It's not like fishing where you have a distributed know-how, right? You have a small-scale fisher. There's no small-scale oil and gas industry, right? So I mean, to put it blankly, risk assessment, right? If there is an uncontrolled oil spill on the surface of the water, there is basically nothing that can happen, and there is a non-negligible chance that small-scale fishery of Newfoundland will be obliterated for at least a couple of years. Simply because of the oil washing up on the shore, washing up onto the Grand Banks. Most of it would probably go to Ireland. Too bad for Ireland, but some of it, there's a non-zero chance that that could happen. And the more wells you drill, the greater the likelihood that something bad will happen. And there's very little that the regulator or the industry can do for about 2 months if there is an uncontrolled well blowout. You would be back with the Deepwater Horizon event. And lastly, is the small-scale fisher perspective included in provincial discussions of socioeconomic planning for energy production? All those visions for how it is that the offshore oil and gas industry will be part of the blue economy, will generate hydrogen, will develop offshore wind. We've seen how offshore wind is not necessarily a benign development in relation to fishing. Well, it's now that in the relationship, in the tenuous relationship, which is largely mediated by the union in Newfoundland of the small-scale fishers and the big majors that are doing the offshore oil and gas development, it's now that we need to get these forward-looking relationships that will perhaps be pertinent when we do wind and when we do hydrogen, and we have those have to be got right now, because the future will depend upon, even for a dying industry, my view is the future of the blue economy will depend on how we develop those relationships and those accountabilities now. Thank you.
We are at 7:30, even though you did say that they will wait with the bus.
Apparently the bus is going in waves, so there's apparently
Okay.
we don't need to rush, but.
Okay, so we did give everyone a chance for one question at least, so we'll take the question here.
Yeah, no, thanks for the presentation. Keep solving with the fish food and allied workers here, and dealt with the oil and gas industry a fair amount. And my observation is that there's oil and gas in the ground, continental shelf. There's really nothing any other stakeholders are going to say that are really going to prevent the development. What we're seeing is you get a copy and paste and the information from the environmental assessment, and the EPO doesn't necessarily say too much. We've done things like putting billion-dollar bids. People were surprised we had that money. Of course we did, but make the points to put in bids on the oil and gas grounds and everything else. But I'd be interested to know from your observations anywhere else, people in small scale fisheries have some success really making a significant difference. I think we've made some small differences, but I don't think preventing oil and gas going on prime fishing grounds, for example, I don't think, when you mentioned provincial government, I don't think it's there in this province. Really oil and gas focused, even with the current climate issues and everything else, still really focused on oil and gas versus fisheries. I don't know if you have any success stories from elsewhere.
Well, I mean, Nova Scotia has a success story. In the 80s, it was the fishers, it was the inshore fishing community, especially when they got the Americans on board, that chased Texaco off of Georges Bank, one of the most important spawning grounds for Southwest Nova Scotia. So that happened, and there, but in general, it's a sad story, but in general, internationally, it's the case that small-scale fishers are, for all the reasons what you just described is true, and more so in other, and this is why, for example, in small island developing nations, there's a real concern. I myself am very concerned about the potential for what will happen in the Arctic. Yeah, because I think that's coming, certainly for natural gas, which is perhaps less of an issue than oil, but yeah.
Just to reiterate, the experience of Newfoundland is not uncommon, where the fishing industry and the oil and gas industry have very different political paths. And Guyana right now, Trinidad, we just finished doing some work in Barbados with the fishing industry does not have a chance because of the nature of the economies and the nature of what's in the commons. Not what manifests itself in reality. for what's promised. And the oil industry, if they come to a place like, we actually work with people up in the Arctic. And when the government says no, they don't try to fight it, they just say, fine, we'll go somewhere else. And they'll go somewhere where there's less opposition. And then that changes the equation. All of a sudden, people who are supporting oil and gas development in Canada, they now have a stronger voice because they can say, see, you're just losing all this opportunity. It's a game that's played all the time.
Great to end on a positive note. Our response, yeah.
Sorry about that.
So thank you again. A round of applause for all of our students.